All right, here we are at episode 3. This is going to cover the transmission and transmission details only, so let's get it started. So this video is going to be specifically for the transmission and why I chose the one I did. I chose the Allison 2350 HS transmission, and it's not like I chose it. It actually kind of fell in my lap after I decided that the AT545 was not going to be ideal. I started looking for a different transmission, and I saw this on Craigslist. It was located in Detroit, which really isn't that far away, and I got it for a really good price. It was out of a Chevy C5500, I guess like a limo bus. It's a large vehicle, and it had a Duramax coupled to it. And the guy who was selling it just wanted the Duramax, had no use for this transmission, and put it up for sale. And I just happened to find it. I don't know how this works, but I found it, and I jumped on it. I went and picked it up. So what is an Allison 2350 HS? Okay, well, it's a cousin to the Allison 1000. Allison 1000 is very common in Duramax Chevys and GMCs. It's identical. Its package size is identical. The weight is identical. The only thing that's different with this transmission is that it's got a higher weight capacity, and I will go through that in a second. Secondly, we'll discuss this Allison HS deal. An Allison 1000 that's in a Chevy truck or a GMC truck is the same transmission as this HS version that I have. The only difference is the bell housing. A Allison 1000 that's bolted to a Duramax and a pickup truck has a different bell housing. It's a one-piece bell housing where you have the engine, you have the transmission, and you have the bell housing that spans between the two, and that's where the torque converter lies. An HS series is a different architecture, and it was meant for the manufacturers have choices of what transmission they want to bolt to their engine. So this applies to International, Cummins, you name it. But they have an SAE bell housing adapter that is an intermediary piece of bell housing that goes between the transmission and engine. I've only seen two SAE style bell housing adapters for this Cummins. It's an SAE 2 or an SAE 3. And once I go through the spreadsheet, you'll see how this plays into it and how it really just really worked out well for me and this swap. But that's how that works, and that just gives manufacturers options. They can essentially bolt any transmission to their engine with the use of different adapters. I don't know if this applies to standard transmissions, but it's definitely a thing for automatic. As I covered earlier, the AT545, don't want it. It's just, first of all, it's junk and it's not ideal. So we covered the similarities, And as far as the transmission goes that I have, the 2350 HS, it is a 6-speed automatic. It has lockup torque converter and it's got double overdrive. And it's in order for me to use that transmission, it had to be a very specific year of transmission. And I will go through that in the spreadsheet right now. This is vital information that you will need if you want to mate an Allison 1000 series or 2000 series transmission to your mechanical 12 valve. There's some very specific parameters, and we'll just go through this really quick. And it says Allison 1000, but that's the Allison 1000 family, which covers my 2350. I don't think a whole lot of people know this detail, but these were produced starting 2001, and I'm assuming till now. But the ones from 2001 to 2005 were all 5 speeds. And following that, from 2006 till currently, they're 6-speed. But the detail that people don't know is that they're all 6 speeds. It's just that the earlier ones didn't have the valve body that could shift into 6th gear. So there are kits that you can buy where you can convert your 5-speed to a 6-speed. And that could be price prohibitive. Plus, they don't have the torque capacities as the later ones. So the years that I required or needed to work with the 12 valve go between 2006 and 2009. There's the 2006 and 7 had a 650 foot-pound capacity. To 2008 and 2009 bumped it up 10 pounds. Mine is a 2008, so it's a 6-speed, has a little bit higher torque capacity. And the reason for that is to use a standalone TPS to run with the Cummins 12 valve. The only input needed on TCM is the TPS sensor, the throttle position sensor. Anything used after 2009 is going to require extra inputs. I'm not sure what those inputs are, but it's going to require extra inputs. So I don't think you can use that. At least that's what Jason had said at transmissiontuner.com. These are the optimal years that you want to find. And if you can find it, pick it up and use it. And that's what I got. So now let's go through some of the physical dimensions and properties of this 1000 family. And I'll just show you the difference between an Allison 1000 and an Allison 2350 HS and what the differences are between them. Okay, so here's a quick look at Allison's brochure regarding the Allison 1000 series. So I highlighted the 1000 HS and the 2350 HS. As you can see, identical in every aspect, up to the max gross vehicle weight. The 1000 is good for 19.5. The 2350 is good for 30K, which is more than what I need. Max gross combined weight, pretty high, 26,000. And with the 2350, it is 30K. So again, even if I'm towing a car behind it, it is well up to the task. But The horsepower rating, torque rating, pretty much all the same. Um, what you do see here, though, is for the max torque, they do have some limiting factors here. They have this 660 foot-pound max only for vehicles that, if it's connected to an electronic engine where there's some torque management, but without torque management, it's good for 550 foot-pounds. Maybe more. Again, I don't know, but I don't want to blow it up. So that covers that. So now that we know the transmission variables, if you will, and the differences between 1000 and 2350, which are essentially nothing, we'll move on to the spreadsheet. And there's going to be some overlapping info here because of the transmission I chose was going to decide how or how I approached the differential. As stated in a previous video about the gearing and how this Allison just fell in my lap, and with its overdrive capabilities, and 6 gears very deep, I didn't have to re-gear the differential. I won't have to re-gear. And really, it just works out for the best because now first gear is going to be super low, and it's going to cruise with the double overdrive. It's going to cruise at a really reasonable RPM. So let's go through that spreadsheet. All right, let's go through the spreadsheet. This is how I determined which transmission I wanted. So to start off with, I have the details on the bus, but those are really irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. But as far as the RV goes, right now, it has a rear diff ratio of 4.56. So that is a really low gear. That's extremely low. Good or bad, doesn't matter. But that's how it was geared for the 454. So that transmission is a 3-speed, no lockup, and the third gear is a 1-to-1 ratio. So at 60 miles an hour, the engine spins at 2374. And keep in mind that these numbers are theoretical. It doesn't take into account the slip that occurs in the torque converter, and there's a lot of slip going on. So these are not true numbers. It's actually going to be a little bit higher, 300 RPM higher. And I can verify that. When I did have it on the highway at 60 miles an hour and indicated 60 miles an hour, it was 3,000 RPM, 3,100 RPM, so it's quite high. And going back to the AT545, which I originally planned on using, I've said it 100 times, I know, but it has a 4-speed with a 1-to-1 final drive in 4th gear, so it would have been spinning the same RPM as a gasoline engine, and it doesn't have a torque converter lockup. So a diesel engine spinning $3,000, I went to got 55 miles an hour out of that thing. So next we'll just cover some of the specs and how I had progressed through this process of maybe doing some sort of transmission swap, because I knew that the AT545 was not going to work out for me, and I better address that now because I'm going to hate myself when that transmission just wasn't ideal, and it isn't. So going from the AT545, I had initially thought or thought of possibly um, getting an MT643. It is 100% mechanical, so it kind of stuck with that theme, and it does have a lockup torque converter, but it's still at the fourth gear is a 1-to-1, so RPMs would have dropped a couple hundred, 300. And then we have the Allison 1000 series, or the 2350, and as you can see, the sixth gear is a super deep overdrive. Um, so let's look at some of the capacities. The AT545 had a 30,000, let's step that back, a 235 horsepower max, a 445 foot-pound max, and it had a 30,000 pound gross vehicle weight rating, no lockup, with an SAE3 bolt pattern, and that's important. Let's remember that. The MT643 was a max of 250 horsepower, up a little, with a max torque of 640 foot-pounds, and a GVWR of 73, over 73K, which is crazy, but it did have lockup in third gear and fourth gear, and it has an SAE2 bolt pattern, so it's a different bell housing adapter. And then the Allison 2350 has a max horsepower of 340 and 660 on the foot-pounds and 33K for the GVWR. It's a Gen 4. As I said earlier, there's that specific year range where they turn to 6-speed. That's a Gen 4. You want a Gen 4. Unless you want to go with the Gen 3 and do a valve body swap. But then you're talking thousands of dollars. Just get the Gen 4 and be done with it. And that is an SAE3 bolt pattern. So it has the same bolt pattern as the AT545, which means that this is a direct bolt-on to this Cummins. I will not have to swap out bell housing adapters. It's going to be a direct swap. No modifications required. I have seen documented videos where people have swapped this very specific combination, AT545 to Allison 1000. So again, it just worked out for the best. It couldn't have came together better than it did. So, and now I'm going to go through the RPM numbers and what I would have had to do if I went with the AT545 or the MT643. So I would have had to re-gear. So looking at, let's go over the advantages and disadvantages. Let's say you're thinking about using an AT545. Here's some advantages and disadvantages. What do you think, Ziggy? Anyways, here we go. The advantage for me was that it came with the bus. Obviously, it's junk now, but the advantage is it came with the bus and it was a 4-speed. The disadvantage is it's old tech. Capacity is limited. It's an almost even match for the engine that's connected to it now, the Cummins. It's almost a perfect match. So really, I don't think I would have been able to mess with the horsepower because it would have ate that transmission for lunch. Another disadvantage, no lockup converter. So the use of a exhaust brake, kind of out of the question. As I had mentioned earlier, I'm toying with the idea of going with or installing an exhaust brake. If I would have used this transmission, that's not an option because without a lockup torque converter, essentially all that engine braking isn't being utilized because the torque converter is still slipping and it's not a direct connection to the engine. So the exhaust brake is less effective. Will it work? Sure, a little bit, but it'll be way less effective. The torque converter in the AT545 was pretty sloppy. There was a high slip value in that, so there's a lot of slip. And we'll go through the numbers, but I would have had to re-gear because the RPMs, if I didn't re-gear, the engine would be screaming at $3,000 at 60 miles an hour, which isn't realistic. Also, another disadvantage is that there's no park, which blows people away. On a regular automatic transmission, there's always this park position where you can put it in park. That has a park pawl. Being the bus is equipped with air brakes, they would go to neutral, engage the parking brakes, and that's what kept the vehicle parked and from moving. So there's no park. So that really would have thrown a wrench in it for me, because the RV needs park, and I would have needed a parking brake with that transmission. That's a whole nother deal right there. So going with back to the spreadsheet here, and again, all these calculations are based with a 32-inch diameter tire, and that applies to all of my spreadsheets here, all my calculations. It's all with the same size tire. So if I would have been able to re-gear the differential at 3.57 ratio, which is, these are all commercially available. These are all commercially available to the Dana 70 HD. Everyone has them. So looking at the chart, after re-gearing, it would have put the RPMs at 2250. And again, that isn't taking into account the slip and the torque converter with the AT545. So it would have been higher. You can figure 200-300 RPM. So you can see that it's still too high. It's just too high for that engine. Especially when the torque, it peaks at 1600. It's just not good. Going to what I would consider ideal, and it might not even still be ideal, but a 307 gear set would have brought the RPM down to 1935. Again, not accounting for slips. So, you're looking at 2200 RPM, cruising RPM at 60 miles an hour. And it's, that's on the border. That's right on the edge. I didn't even do calculations for the MT643 because essentially the numbers are going to match the AT545 because of the fourth gear being 1-to-1. The only difference being that the torque converter locks on the 643, so it'd bring the RPM down that 200-300 RPM. So realistically, the engine might be spinning 2000 RPM with the MT643, which still isn't great. So what are the advantages to the MT643? Advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that it has a higher torque and horsepower capability, so tweaking the engine was a possibility. Another advantage is that it's it has a lockup torque converter, which makes it exhaust brake friendly. Disadvantage is that it would have required the bell housing adapter change. It requires a much larger bell housing adapter, that SAE2/3 thing that I had going on. So I would have had to change that out, including the flywheel. Another disadvantage, it's heavy. I believe that transmission weighs close to 600, maybe even more pounds. It's a beast. It's heavy. And at the end of the day, it's still old. It's still obsolete. Finding parts for either of these two transmissions might be kind of iffy because they are obsolete. And if you need replacement parts, you're probably going to go to a junkyard and find used parts, which just isn't good. Another disadvantage, it still requires regearing. It's not getting the RPMs down where I want it. And similar to the AT545, it has no parking pole. So I'm still in that issue of having no park. The AT545, an option for them was a driveline brake. There's a drum brake on the drive shaft, because obviously some of these AT545s were used on vehicles that didn't have air brakes, so you required a parking brake, and that's what they use. It's just a lever pull drum brake on the driveline that parks your vehicle. That was a common thing, and I've seen used ones, and I think it was just a matter of bolting it onto the back of the transmission, so it's not such a huge deal. With the MT643, I think it was a huge deal because I look for driveline parking brakes for the MT643, couldn't find any. So either they don't exist or it's super rare. So it was really starting, the glimmer of hope for the MT643 was really starting to fade, until this Allison came along. So now getting back to the Allison, looking at the chart for that, so without regearing, now the rear differential is still at 4.56 gear ratio. At 60 miles an hour in 6th gear with torque converter lockup, the engine is spinning 1753. That's a much better RPM range. So I can only imagine the fuel economy will be better too. It's going to be better on fuel with that dual overdrive. So looking at the advantages and disadvantages, I've seen on the internet where this is an absolute dream combo. You get all the benefits of the 12-valve Cummins, and with its, it's a 1,000,000-mile engine, and this Allison, they're known to go 1,000,000 miles too. So as long as you keep the fluids clean and you maintain them, they're going to treat you well. So advantages and disadvantages. Advantage, it's a 6-speed double overdrive lockup torque converter. We've covered that. Once it goes into 2nd gear, it goes into lockup. But that'll be programmable because when Jason does the standalone TCU, we can tweak how this transmission behaves. A little bit more on that later. Another advantage, it's going to bolt up to the engine as is to the adapter. I'd covered that too. It's modern. Parts are going to be available. It has a much higher horsepower and torque capacity. It has park. I don't have to worry about the parking brake right away. I think you should have a parking brake, but this transmission has park, like a regular transmission. It's electronic, It has adaptive learning, and it will be able to accept custom tunes. It can have normal towing. You can also program a tow haul mode if necessary. And a disadvantage, it's electronic. It's going to require a standalone TCU. And I've mentioned Jason before at transmissiontuners.com. I've been in contact with him, and he says this is going to be a piece of cake. And the only thing you'll need is a TPS sensor for that range of transmission. So that's pretty much the biggest deciding factors of which transmission I chose and how it kind of evolved and really how it's the ideal situation. So that's pretty much how it was decided for which transmission I need to use. It's not like I chose this transmission. It was decided for me. So I need a second opinion. Hey, what do you think?
It just makes common sense.
There you go. You can't deny the science. So the next video is going to cover all the remaining systems left in the vehicle, brakes, cooling, whatnot. And we'll cover it then. So thanks for watching.